In this lecture, we're going to cover the content or part of the content in Chapter 2 of your textbook, The Parts of Speech. The English language has 8 parts of speech: nouns, pronouns, adjectives, verbs, adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions, and interjections. We covered verbs a little bit in last week's lecture, so for this lecture, we are not going to discuss verbs. We will cover verbs in more detail in the next lecture. So in this lecture, we will cover the other 7 parts of speech. As you noted in a previous lecture, nouns are what we called naming words. The classic definition of a noun is that it names a person, place, thing, or idea. Some examples: Mr. Obama, Mr. President. These are names. Washington, D.C., the White House. These are places. Air Force One, the airplane. These are things. Liberty, happiness. These are ideas. And all these are nouns. Now, I don't want you to get confused between nouns and subjects. As we saw in a previous lecture, a noun can be the subject of a sentence, but it can also be other things, such as the direct object, the indirect object, and the object of a preposition. In this sentence, Dr. Kitty gave the students the papers on the table. All of the underlined items are nouns, yet not all of them are subjects. The subject of the sentence is Dr. Kitty. Students is the indirect object. It's to whom Dr. Kitty gave the papers. The direct object is papers. It's what Dr. Kitty gave to the students. And the location of the papers are on the table. So table is the object of the preposition on. In the previous sentence, also note that Dr. Kitty is a proper noun because it names a specific person. Mr. Obama, Washington, D.C., Air Force One, and the White House are also proper nouns because they name specific people, places, or things. So proper nouns are always capitalized. Common nouns, on the other hand, such as here we have teacher, school, rug, liberty, are not referring to any one thing specific, so they are not capitalized. The next part of speech that we want to look at is pronouns. Pronouns function as a substitution for nouns so that we don't have to keep repeating the noun. The number one rule to remember when using pronouns is that they can only substitute for a noun that has already been explicitly stated in a paragraph. Pronouns without any clear antecedent are called faulty pronominal references. In formal writing, the pronominal reference also does not carry across paragraphs. That means that when you start a new paragraph, you must restate the noun before you can use the pronoun. So let's look at some examples. This would be wrong. Although she said that she would go directly home, Mary stopped for another drink. Now, what is wrong with that sentence? The sentence starts, although she said that she would go directly home. In that sentence, she comes before the noun Mary. So we do not know at the beginning of the sentence who she refers to. So the correct way to write that sentence would be as here, although Mary said that she would go directly home, she stopped for another drink. In this sentence, we can clearly see that the two pronouns she refer back to the noun Mary. Another rule is that a pronoun must not be used if a new noun intervenes between the original noun and the pronominal reference. So here we have an example. The files arranged by the temporary workers were out of order, so we sent them back to the main office. Now, what's wrong with that sentence? Them refers back to the refers back to the temporary workers, but we meant it to refer back to the files. So the files arranged by the temporary workers were out of order, so we sent them back to the main office is saying we sent the workers back to the main office. So to make it unambiguous, we have an example here. We would rewrite the sentence. The files arranged by the temporary workers were out of order, so we sent the files back to the main office. Then it's clear what's being sent back to the main office. Another point to consider is that the pronoun must agree in number with the noun. So it would be wrong to say everyone has to be careful with how they use their pronouns. Everyone is singular. It's a singular subject, but then following is the pronoun and possessive that says they and their, which is plural. So the right way to write that sentence is to either make the noun plural or to make the pronoun singular. Usually making the noun plural is less awkward. So here, for example, we have people have to be careful with how they use their pronouns. People is plural, they is plural, there is plural. We have a sentence where the pronouns are in agreement with the noun. Another way of doing this is, as I said, to make the noun, leave the noun singular and make the pronouns also singular, but in this case, we would get a very awkward sentence. We would have everyone has to be careful with how he or she uses his or her pronouns. Now, why do I need to use he or she and his or her? Because if I just use one gender, I am having sexism in my language. So to avoid sexism, I have to refer to both pronouns. But to avoid that awkwardness altogether, I can just write the entire sentence in the plural. If you look at your book on page 40, there's a list of the most common pronouns used in the English language. So you want to look over that list before doing any exercises. Adjectives are one of the easiest parts of speech to understand. We briefly met adjectives in our previous lecture in our discussion of predicate adjectives with linking verbs. Adjectives are used to modify or describe nouns or pronouns. They answer questions like which one, what kind, how much, whose, how many. And they usually, although not always, precede the noun or pronoun that they modify. The next part of speech we want to talk about is adverbs. Adverbs are a little bit more complicated than adjectives in that as adjectives modify nouns or pronouns, adverbs modify verbs. They also modify adjectives, and they also modify other adverbs. Very often, adverbs in the English language end in ly, but not always. So on page 59 in your textbook, let's look at a few examples. Jackie Joyner Kersey runs gracefully. In this sentence, gracefully is an adverb. We can tell because it ends in ly, and also it modifies the verb runs. It tells us how Jackie runs. She runs gracefully. In the next sentence, Jackie runs very gracefully. Here we have an example of an adverb modifying a verb, as we saw in the first sentence. Gracefully describes how Jackie runs. But we also have a adverb very that's describing gracefully. So we see how gracefully, very gracefully. In the next sentence, Jackie ran an extremely graceful race. In this case, we have the noun race, And graceful is now used as an adjective. Notice the lack of ly, describing the noun race. What kind of race? A graceful race. And then we have the adverb extremely. Extremely is modifying the adjective graceful. How graceful? Extremely graceful. So these are examples of typical adverbs. We have a couple more examples here where we have adverbs that do not end in ly. So, Joan Caterman swims quite well. How does Joan swim? Joan swims well. So well is a adverb. It's an adverb that describes how Joan swims. And how well does Joan swim? She swims quite well. So quite is also an adverb that is modifying another adverb, well. Some more examples that are unusual. There is the book. There is an adverb. It tells us where the book is located. Do the assignment now. Now is the adverb telling when. So typically when you think of adverbs, think of examples of how, where, and when. Those will typically be adverbs in the sentence. And then one final example here, the word not is always an adverb as well. Not is an adverb in this sentence, Henry will not lie. Not is an adverb that modifies the verb will lie by restricting its meaning. In other words, under what condition will Henry lie? And the answer is not at all. Another thing to take note of is good versus well. Good is an adjective. Well is an adverb. This is something that adult speakers of English often get confused. People will say, I don't feel good. Now, normally to the grammatical rule where feel is being used as a linking verb, the linking verb should be followed by a noun or an adjective. So grammatically, I don't feel good makes sense because good is an adjective and feel in that case is a linking verb. If I say feel as an active verb, one that takes a direct object, then I feel my stomach, I feel the book, I feel the table. That's not a linking verb anymore. But so you'd expect that you would use well only when you have an active verb. But there's an exception with health. When we talk about our health, we do say, I don't feel well or I do feel well, not good. So that is just something you have to memorize. The next part of speech we want to talk about is the preposition. Prepositions serve many purposes. They introduce a prepositional phrase that often answers a question or position such as in, on, by, behind, in front of, or against. Or a preposition can answer a question of time, such as before, after, during, over, past, or upon. A preposition always introduces a prepositional phrase that ends with a noun or a pronoun. These are called the object of the preposition and thus cannot be the subject, direct object, or indirect object of a sentence. Page 61 to 62 in your textbook gives a list of the most common prepositions. Note, however, that this list only includes 54 prepositions. There are actually far more prepositions in the English language. In fact, we have today over 150 active prepositions. Many are just one word, But we also have prepositions that are composed of two words, such as according to, or across from, or ahead of, or along with. And then we have prepositions that are composed of three words, such as far as soon as well as. And then we have prepositions that include nouns as part of the phrase. So, for example, by means of, by virtue of, in accordance with. And then finally, we have about over 40 prepositions that are either dialectical or archaic, such as betwixt, such as ere, such as gainward, such as overthwart. These are words that are dialectical or not commonly used. And then finally, just to make things a little bit more complicated, we have 10 not quite prepositions, although they function as prepositions. They're called postpositions. And what that means is these are words that go at the end of the clause. So, for example, 3 years ago, or notwithstanding, or withal, which is also an archaic one. So, in other words, there are quite a number of prepositions in the English language. The next part of speech that we want to consider is the conjunction. We have two types of conjunctions, the coordinating conjunctions and the subordinating conjunctions. The coordinating conjunctions are used to connect two independent clauses into a compound sentence, and they are also used to group objects in a list. One way to remember the coordinating conjunctions is to remember the fanboys. The fanboys represent for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. These are the only coordinating conjunctions. These are the only words that can be used to join two independent clauses into a compound sentence. Then we have the subordinating conjunctions. The subordinating conjunctions are used to introduce a dependent clause. The clause that they introduce is dependent on the independent clause. What that means is that the dependent clause by itself does not make sense. Even though it has a subject and a verb, because it starts with a subordinating conjunction, it creates a condition. It is not a complete thought. So, for example, after I go to the store, that is a dependent clause. It starts with the subordinating conjunction after. It has a subject, I. It has a verb, go. But it's not a complete thought. After I go to the store, what? Or although I wanted to visit. Although is the subordinate conjunction, I is the subject, wanted is the verb, but it's not a complete thought. Although I wanted to visit. What? As I was eating breakfast. Again, as is the subordinating conjunction. I is the subject, was is the verb, was eating is the complete verb, and it's again an incomplete thought. As I was eating breakfast, what? What happened as I was eating breakfast? So subordinating conjunctions introduce dependent clauses which are not complete sentences. If you look at page 64 of your textbook, you'll see a list of the most common subordinating conjunctions. The final part of speech that we want to consider in this lecture is the interjection. Don't confuse the word interjection with the word injection. Interjection is its own word. So, the interjection is a word that expresses an emotion or surprise, dismay, anything that has some kind of emotion behind it, and it's voiced as an exclamation. It doesn't necessarily need an exclamation point, but it often does have one. So usually an exclamation or an interjection will appear at the beginning of a sentence or at the start of a sentence. So examples of interjections: wow, or ah, that tastes great. Or, OMG, I can't believe he said that. Those are all examples of interjections. So the point here is that an interjection is not just one word, it can be a whole sentence.